All right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you from really around the world. I didn't think we'd have somebody from Australia on, but that's certainly a pleasure. As Confederate General Jubal Early withdrew from the gates of Washington, D.C., in front of Fort Stevens on the night of July 12th, 1864, and headed west toward the Shenandoah Valley, Early and his command really tried to assess the overall significance of their movement to the gates of Washington, D.C. There were some individuals in Jubal Early's army who believed that the march to the outskirts of Washington was a smashing success because it drew Union forces away from Petersburg and therefore the Confederate capital in Richmond. Father James Sheeran, who was the chaplain of the 14th Louisiana, he wrote this in his diary about the strategic effect of Early's push to Washington that summer. And he wrote simply, the object of his, meaning Early's mission, was accomplished, to draw their forces from Richmond. From Jubal Early's perspective, he thought that his campaign had achieved much more than just a strategic diversion and alleviating pressure on the Army of Northern Virginia. So during that night of July 12th, as Early's men were departing that area from in front of Fort Stevens, Jubal Early turned to one of his staff officers, Henry Kidd Douglas, and he boasted, "We haven't taken Washington, but we've scared Abe Lincoln like hell." When I was working on my book about the Battle of Cool Spring, I was curious, was there any validity to that statement? Early liked to boast about it. Henry Kidd Douglas liked to repeat it. But I think it's safe to say Lincoln felt a lot of emotions in mid-July of 1864. But fear of Early, being scared of Early, that Early was going to take Washington, wasn't really one of them. I think Lincoln had an enormous amount of confidence in the defenses of the Capitol. There were certainly many people in Washington who were fearful what Early might do, but Lincoln was not one of them. If Lincoln felt any emotion at all in July 1864, it was aggravation. John Hay, who was one of Lincoln's private secretaries, he wrote in his diary, "The president is in good feather this evening. He seems not in the least concerned about the safety of Washington." Now, as you had individuals in the Confederate Army like Father Sheeran thinking it achieved much, Jubal Early thinking it scared Lincoln like hell, there were others in Jubal Early's army who believed that they had really lost an opportunity to do something great for the Confederate war effort. There were some Confederates who thought that if Jubal Early would have actually attacked the Capitol, if he would have somehow been able to push through those defenses north of Washington, that could have altered dramatically the course of the conflict. Months after the fight for Fort Stevens was over and Early, of course, was fighting in the Shenandoah Valley in the autumn of 1864, fighting against General Philip Sheridan, there were a number of Confederate soldiers who had been wounded at places like 3rd Winchester or Fisher's Hill or Cedar Creek, who had been taken to a Confederate hospital in Americus, Georgia. And one of the nurses working in that hospital, Kate Cummings, who you see there on the screen, she overheard a conversation that was taking place between several wounded men who fought with Early in the Valley in the autumn of 1864. They had been part of Early's army that pushed to the outskirts of Washington. And she wrote in her diary about what they said. Wounded men who were with General Early in his late disastrous campaign blame General Early for not marching right up to Washington as they think he could have taken it. There were those individuals in Early's army who thought that he could have indeed taken Washington, but any success would have been short-lived. They had no supplies, there were no reinforcements, they were cut off. John Alexander Stikelether, who was a soldier in the 4th North Carolina Infantry, he surmised that had we taken Washington, the advantages to us perhaps would have been temporary. Now, while the soldiers in Early's army, they possess varying perspectives about what that push to the outskirts of Washington actually achieved, they all agreed on one thing. They were completely and utterly exhausted, and they desperately wanted rest. I know a lot of people, and I've spent my whole professional life, researching and writing and speaking about the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley. And everyone always likes to talk about the hundreds of miles that Stonewall Jackson's army marched in the spring of 1862, nearly 700. And it's true, Jackson did that, but that was between March and early June. Jubal Early's army, in a month, from the time they left Petersburg, moved to Lynchburg, moved north through the valley into Maryland to the outskirts of Washington and back, in that 1 month time span, they had marched 500 miles. And of course, they fought at various points and they endured excruciating heat that summer. They were exhausted, they were worn out, and they simply wanted rest. Private Henry Hanger of the 14th Virginia Cavalry, I think, succinctly captured what all of Early's men were feeling in mid-July. We are nearly worn out and must necessarily have a little rest. But that much desired, that much needed rest would prove elusive. While Early's army wanted a respite from marching and fighting, President Lincoln wanted something too. He wanted Jubal Early pursued, and he wanted Jubal Early destroyed. And it's really important to remember, and I always remind, every group I speak to, whether it's a group like this or even my classes at Shenandoah, everything that happens in 1864, particularly the summer and the autumn, has the 1864 presidential election looming over it. And so Lincoln is cognizant of this. Lincoln is cognizant of the fact that this is not going to bode well for his bid for re-election. He understands that there is going to be criticism. And so the remedy for this in President Lincoln's mind is having an immediate and eager pursuit. But of course, Lincoln can't order a pursuit of Jubal Early's army, because in order for that pursuit to happen, you need to have a commander put in charge of a unified force. And the troops that had been sent to Washington, the troops that were already in Washington, they were all responsible to a different commander. So basically what needs to happen, to kind of simplify things here, is President Lincoln needs to wait for Ulysses S. Grant, who is the general-in-chief, to appoint someone to be at the head of this pursuit force. And Lincoln, of course, I think if you look at the diaries of John Hay and John Nicolay, Lincoln wanted to, kind of intervene as commander-in-chief and say, I'm going to put this person in charge, go get Jubal Early. But Lincoln, he knew he couldn't do that because it would damage the relationship between him and General Grant. When Lincoln entrusted Grant with responsibilities as general-in-chief in March of 1864, he promised Grant that unless Grant procrastinated significantly, and I'm talking like McClellan-like procrastination here, that he would not interfere with these decisions. And Grant, I think, ultimately acted pretty quickly. Less than 24 hours after Jubal Early had withdrawn from the gates of Washington, Grant placed General Horatio Wright, who you see there on the screen, the commander of the Army of the Potomac Sixth Corps. He placed him at the head of all of those forces, in total about 30,000 Union troops that were going to go and chase Jubal Early, destroy him, and eliminate Jubal Early once and for all as a threat to the capital. So Wright's force, it left Washington around 3 o'clock in the afternoon of July 13th. And of course, you can see there on the map the pursuit out of Washington and, of course, the pursuit towards the Shenandoah Valley. Well, 4 days after that pursuit began, the lead elements of Wright's force a brigade of infantry commanded by Colonel James Mulligan, and a division of cavalry commanded by General Alfred Dufay. They crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains. They neared the Blue Ridge Mountains right here at Snickers Gap, which is circled on the map on red. And they engaged Confederate pickets near Castleman's Ferry. Until nightfall, Dufay's command and Mulligan's command, they had tried desperately to force Confederates from General John B. Gordon's division from the banks of the Shenandoah River. But all of those efforts proved futile. After fighting subsided that day, late that night, Jubal Early gave an order to Confederate General John Breckinridge, because Early did not think that the fighting on the 17th was just going to solve all the problems. He knew that there would undoubtedly be more fighting as more troops came up that following day. So around 10 o'clock that night, he instructed General Breckinridge to have his troops under arms at daylight. And if any attempt at a crossing is made, he wishes the most determined resistance made to it. So while Early was kind of getting his ducks in a row, so to speak, that night of July 17th, about 8 miles east of Snickers Gap, at the hamlet of Purcellville, Virginia, Horatio Wright instructed General George Crook to march his command, which was part of the Army of West Virginia, to march his command in the morning and strike the enemy along the banks of the Shenandoah. From Horatio Wright's perspective, he thought that this would be a really easy task. He had not yet received all the intelligence of the difficulties that Dufay and Mulligan confronted on the 17th. I mean, Horatio Wright really believed that Early had left the valley. He wrote to Henry Halleck that evening, "I have no doubt the enemy is in full retreat for Richmond." So as George Crook's regiments prepared themselves for that early morning march, there were some soldiers in that command who eagerly anticipated the upcoming fight. One of those individuals was William McMurphy. So McMurphy actually was part of a hodgepodge of dismounted cavalry that had been cobbled together a few weeks before Horatio Wright's pursuit began. You had about 1,000 men from 27 different cavalry regiments commanded by Colonel Sam Young. And so that night from Purcellville, and you can see the first page of the letter there on the screen, he wrote a letter to his mother, and he explained how tired he was, how exhausted he was, but also how excited he was for this upcoming battle. And he wrote, "I hope we can whip the Rebs this summer, for I am getting sick of soldiering. My feet are one mass of blisters, but the hopes of using up the Johnnies this summer is as good as plaster for my feet. I don't know what the reason is, but every time I think of going into a fight, I feel bully." So if you really look closely at this letter, he's excited not because it's an opportunity to fight, but he's excited because hopefully this is going to help bring about an end to the war. He's sick and tired of the fighting. As George Crook's regiments approached Snickers Gap around 9 a.m. on July the 18th, he witnessed what would ultimately become the final effort of Union cavalry under Dufay's command to drive the Confederates from Castleman's Ferry. After watching 75 troopers from the 22nd Pennsylvania Cavalry launch an ill-fated attack, Crook decided to change things. And so he decided, and this was probably ill-advised in retrospect, he decided to send all of Dufay's cavalry from Snickers Gap. So if you're following my little pointer here on the screen, here's Snickers Gap right here. And he decided to send them all the way to Ashby's Gap down here. So what Crook was thinking is that I send Dufay's men 9 miles to the south. And then the idea is they would cut across Ashby's Gap and then cut off any potential line of retreat for Early's army. Now, while Crook thought this was a good idea in the moment, it deprived Union forces of cavalry. that could have undoubtedly proved useful later that day in gathering information about the true strength of Jubal Early's army. And this was something, by the way, that Horatio Wright ultimately gave his blessing to as well. So late that morning, early afternoon, Horatio Wright and George Crook are standing up there near Snickers Gap, conferring atop the Blue Ridge Mountains about what to do next. And so they had not been fully aware of Early's complete strength. And so they came up with this plan to, instead of just attacking directly at Castleman's Ferry, let's try to flank the position. So here was the plan. About 2 p.m., the officer you see there on the screen, Colonel Joseph Thoburn, he received orders from Crook to take his small division and another brigade of infantry commanded by Colonel Daniel Frost, about 5,000 men in total. The plan was to march them to Island Ford. So if you're looking at this map, where this red star is up here, this is Island Ford. To cross the Shenandoah River at Island Ford, then turn south and attack the Confederates at Castleman's Ferry. But in order for Thoburn to get into that position where he could cross, he needed to navigate narrow paths through the Blue Ridge Mountains, an area that he was not familiar with. So the key person in all of this, and this is one of the most fascinating stories to me to come out of the Battle of Cool Spring. So the person who was so critical in guiding Thoburn to this point, right here, Island Ford, was a fellow named John Kerrigan. So John Kerrigan, in the summer of 1864, was the chief musician of the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. So he's part of this pursuit force commanded by Horatio Wright. Now, Kerrigan was born in 1818 in New York City. But at an early age, his family had actually moved to the Shenandoah Valley, to Clark County, Virginia, and to the vicinity of Castleman's Ferry. So where the fighting opened on the 17th, this is the area where John Kerrigan spent a considerable chunk of his life as a boy, as a teenager, and for much of his adulthood. When the Civil War broke out in the spring of 1861, John Kerrigan, who was known as Barney, that was his nickname by his friends, he enlisted as a musician in the 2nd Virginia Infantry. So this is a regiment, as many of you know, would ultimately become part of the famed Stonewall Brigade. So he starts the war as a Confederate. March 11th, 1862, John Kerrigan deserted from that regiment, kind of falls off the radar a little bit, and then he pops up January 3rd, 1864, enlisting in the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. So what compelled John Kerrigan to enlist in the Confederate service, to desert, and then enlist in the Union Army is not known. Unfortunately, John Kerrigan left no real, written record of his military service or his thoughts, ended up committing suicide in 1888. But in the book, I discuss some possibilities about why he did what he did. So one of the possibilities is he was always, from the outset of things, being a native New Yorker, maybe he always was a Unionist. And he decided to enlist in a Virginia regiment, in a Confederate regiment, to give the illusion of Confederate loyalty for purposes of self-preservation in an area that was so staunchly Confederate. And if in fact that was the reason for doing what he did, it's actually not all that unique. There's evidence across the South of people doing things like this. Another possibility is Kerrigan might have grown disenchanted for whatever reason with the Confederate war effort, decided to enlist and change sides. Regardless of why John Kerrigan did what he did, he ultimately became one of 38,000 men from Virginia to don the Union blue. So on the afternoon of July 18th, Kerrigan guided Thoburn's division over mountain paths, down the slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountain, across what's known as the retreat, this whole area right here, much of which is actually owned today by Shenandoah University and interpreted by the Civil War Institute. And he guided them to this point at Island Ford. Now, there was the expectation among Thoburn and his troops that they would get to Island Ford and they would simply be able to cross. They weren't expecting Confederates to be there. But lo and behold, there were. So there's a small little firefight that erupts along the banks of the Shenandoah between the lead element of Colonel Thoburn's command, which was led by this guy right here, Colonel George Wells, and two Virginia regiments, the 42nd and 50th Virginia. Total, those two Virginia units had about 100 men. Colonel Wells has an entire brigade, 1,500 men. And so it was a pretty easy task, 10, 15 minutes to drive the Confederates from the crossing. And this photograph on the screen, basically shows the crossing from the vantage point of Wells's men. Wells's men being over here and those Virginians being over there. Once those Confederates were driven off, once that crossing site was secure, Thoburn begins moving his men across the river. And it's important to understand that even though there is a drought in this part of Virginia at the time, the Shenandoah River is really, really low. You could have really crossed anywhere with a few exceptions. Crossing that river came with some perils. So as Private John Gundy of the 170th Ohio was crossing the river right here, his foot got stuck in something. His friend said it was a snag. Well, his foot was stuck so terribly that it took a few of his friends to yank his leg out to dislodge it. Well, in the process of dislodging that leg, he ended up rupturing his groin. Infection set in. He was discharged from the service as a result of that, and he died from that injury on October 30th, 1864. And what you're seeing on the screen on the left side there is a page from the widow's pension that his widow Anne filed. And the part there that's underlined in red discusses the issue of the crossing, his leg being stuck, the groin being ruptured, and him dying as a result of this. And Gundy's tragic end, I think, serves as a reminder of something really important that maybe sometimes when we go out on the battlefield, we don't think about all that often. And it's this. Soldiers on both sides confronted multiple enemies. So yes, Confederates are the enemies of Union, and Union are the enemy of Confederates. But Union and Confederate soldiers confronted an enemy that knew no allegiance and could be quite unforgiving, and that was the natural environment, Mother Nature. Now, while Thoburn's men were crossing, you had a group of Confederates, about 16 of them, who were coming the other way. They had been captured by Colonel Wells in that small little melee, and they were questioned by Colonel Thoburn. What information could he get out of them about the strength of Early's army? Where were all of the elements of the Confederate army of the Valley? And what Thoburn learned really shocked him, because he learned that there were significant numbers of Confederate troops. John B. Gordon's and Robert Rhodes' division were within a mile or two of the ford. Gabriel Wharton was a few miles away. And so with Thoburn on one side of the river and the rest of Horatio Wright's force still in Snicker's Gap, Thoburn thought that he really ran the risk of being destroyed because he was cut off. He had this natural barrier between him and the rest of the army. So what Thoburn did was he went to George Crook, he appealed to Crook, and he said, "Let me withdraw my command now before it's completely destroyed." And Crook said, "No, just stay put. He said, I don't want you to turn south, so we're going to alter the plan a little bit, but just stay where you're at, form your men in battle lines, and await further instructions. So Thoburn did as he was instructed. He decided to put his men basically in three lines. So there was a line that hugged the Shenandoah River right here. There was another line about 75 yards in front of that, and then a line of skirmishers up here, much closer to what's known as the Cool Spring Mansion. While Thoburn was positioning his troops, George Crook and Horatio Wright were again atop the Blue Ridge, talking, discussing, surveying the field. And as Crook looked out into the distance, as he looked west across the river, he saw something that really deeply concerned him. He saw significant numbers, almost to the tune of 8,000 Confederate soldiers moving toward Thoburn's position near where he had crossed at Island Ford. And so it was at this moment that I think Crook realized he made a mistake. Maybe he should have let Thoburn withdraw. So it's at this moment that Crook turned to Wright and he said, give me the order. I need to bring Thoburn back. And Wright said, nope, leave him where he's at. Tell him that reinforcements are on the way. So the reinforcements that were promised were those from the Union 6th Corps Division, commanded by General James Ricketts, who, of course, you see there on the screen. Even though Ricketts was promised as help, as reinforcement, we're going to see here in a moment that that promise was ultimately not kept. So initially, when the battle begins around 5 o'clock, the first troops to appear are those commanded by General Gabriel Wharton. So Wharton's men, if you follow the little mouse pointer right here, they're up here and they're attacking the far southern end of Thoburn's line. But as I tell individuals every time we go on a tour of Cool Spring, Gabriel Wharton was not the main attraction, but the main distraction. He was supposed to keep Thoburn occupied from the real objective. And the real objective was to take Robert Rhodes' division and have them attack the far northern end of the Union line to launch a flank attack from up here. Well, as it turns out, about 20 minutes or so into this battle, Robert Rhodes' men came bursting through a grove of oak trees. They slammed to the far right flank of Thoburn's men, and the troops who were positioned there, those 1,000 dismounted cavalry commanded by Colonel Samuel Young, they put up very, very little resistance. By most accounts, they fire maybe a volley or two, and then they're retreating back across the Shenandoah River. Now, one of the things that historians sometimes are guilty of, and I think we're all guilty of this, is passing judgment on a group of soldiers for doing something that we think is the obvious reason. But then maybe there's something else that causes them to do what they did. And so, you know, when I really became heavily involved in researching and writing about Cool Spring now 11 years ago, I had heard of this, I had read these accounts, and I thought, well, these guys were cowards. They're not putting up much resistance at all. But as you begin to dig deeper into their letters and diaries, not the post-war writings, but things they're writing in the moment, there are some things that become clearer about why they did what they did, why they acted in the manner they did. So as I mentioned earlier in my remarks this evening, the soldiers who comprised this dismounted cavalry unit, they had been organized only a few weeks earlier. And, you know, I don't even think dismounted cavalry is the right phrase or the right terminology to use here. Because I think when I say that, we think immediately of, like, you know, Buford's men at Gettysburg or whatever the case might be. These men weren't fighting as traditional dismounted cavalry. These are cavalrymen who had lost their mounts. They were being asked to fight as infantry. These guys had been asked to trade in their breech-loading carbines for rifled muskets. So they didn't have any time to drill. They didn't learn how to fight as infantry. And they didn't have sufficient time to, again, just know how to load and fire and work the musket properly. So amid the confusion of battle, once they fire that first volley or that second volley, there are numerous soldiers in Young's command who write that basically they have forgotten the 9-step loading procedure. So Sergeant James Henry Avery from the 5th Michigan Cavalry, who was part of this unit, he confessed that in the excitement of battle after he fired that first round, he took out a round from his cartridge box and didn't open up the cartridge like you're supposed to. He just loaded the thing entirely. Well, it wasn't a Johnson & Dow combustible cartridge, so when he went to shoot it, the musket wouldn't go off, so that gun was disabled. And then he picked up another musket and fired a round, but then he leaned his ramrod up against a tree and fell back a little bit, so he didn't have anything to pull, to ram that round home. Avery wrote, "My old musket bothered me terribly in this fight. It would not go off as I had forgotten to bite the cartridge." So I think the lack of training, the new type of weaponry, and putting these guys into a position where they had never fought together, going up against arguably one of the best divisions in the Army of Northern Virginia, they're really not being set up all that much for success. So as pressure began to mount on that far northern flank, Thoburn started to shuffle his troops and do the best that he could to try to stave off those attacks. And while Thoburn was doing all of this, George Crook accompanied General Ricketts to the banks of the Shenandoah River to see where Ricketts could cross his division. And when Ricketts got there, he saw Rhodes' attack. He saw Colonel Young's command streaming frantically across to the eastern side of the river, and he said, "No way. I am not crossing my men over to that side. I'm not putting my men into the fray." There's an argument that ensues between George Crook and General Ricketts along the banks of the river. Crook saying, "Wright promised, he ordered you to do this." So ultimately, General Wright steps in. So these guys are going back up towards Snicker's Gap. And Wright intervenes and he says, "You know what? On second thought, Ricketts doesn't have to cross. He's right. The battle is lost. I'm not going to needlessly sacrifice additional Union troops." That's all well and good for Ricketts, but Thoburn is stuck on the other side of the river. And so it's at this moment in time, with no support at all, except Union artillery that will be brought in later in the day and positioned in the bluffs on the eastern side of the river. The objective for Thoburn now is not to win the battle. It's not to flank the Confederate position. His mission is singularly to survive. So with the measure of success now shifted to survival, Thoburn very quickly gathered his subordinates together to determine how best to achieve that objective. And he basically gave his brigade and regimental commanders two choices. We can withdraw immediately, get out of here, or we can wait until the cover of darkness to withdraw. And as they mulled over their options, doing so very quickly, Thoburn and all of his subordinates, they believed that it was best to wait until the cover of darkness to retreat. So again, this is a battle that's taking place evening and into the dark of night. Colonel Thomas Wilds of the 116th Ohio, he noted of this decision to stay and fight it out. "The river at our back was too deep to more than walk slowly through, and so escape was out of the question. There was nothing left to do but fight." So I think that sheer tenacity, waiting for the cover of darkness, and the support that he receives, Thoburn receives from 20 Union cannon It's able to allow Thoburn to survive and also heroically to fend off several assaults from Robert Rhodes' division that evening and night. So once darkness descended over the battlefield, Thoburn's infantry, what remained of them, they withdrew to the east side of the river. And once on that side, Thoburn's men really were trying to make sense of what had happened. They wanted to know why ultimately had 72 of their comrades been killed and another 301 wounded. And just in case you're wondering, Early's army suffered about 65 killed and 300 wounded. So the casualties are actually pretty comparable. The veterans of Thoburn's division, they had all sorts of thoughts coursing through their mind in the aftermath of the battle as to who was responsible for this blunder. William Walker, who was the chaplain of the 18th Connecticut, he thought that Horatio Wright did this on purpose. And he wrote, rumors said that it was a plan of General Wright of the Sixth Corps, who ranked General Crook to disgrace the latter. Now, one would like to think that officers who are part of a same army with the same objective wouldn't do something like this. And I don't know that there's any real evidence to suggest that it was done, but I will tell you this, and some of you on this meeting tonight have been with me on various tours in the Valley. Horatio Wright and George Crook did not get along at all. And there are really tense moments later on in Sheridan's campaign where it kind of makes you stop and wonder, well, maybe Wright did this intentionally. But again, there's no real evidence to support that claim. For decades after the battle, Thoburn's veterans, they rehashed, they refought, and they condemned Horatio Wright in regimental histories and the pages of the National Tribune. And they argued that had they been properly supported as they were promised, they would have won the battle. Early could have been defeated. One of the most vociferous, aggressive critics was Sergeant E.T. Sexton of the 5th New York Heavy Artillery. This was the regiment that actually had the highest casualty rate of any of those regiments that fought at the battle. He wrote numerous articles in the National Tribune for 30 years after the war ended, making the same point. As he wrote, the battle would have terminated differently had we been properly supported. Now, although Early's army claimed a victory at Cool Spring, news he received at his headquarters in Berryville, a few miles west of the battlefield, news he received in Berryville the following day, it did what Union forces could not do by fighting on the 17th and 18th. And that was to drive him from the river. On July 19th, Jubal Early learned that a contingent of Union forces commanded by the man you see there on the screen, General William Averell, were moving from Martinsburg to Winchester. So from right up here, Martinsburg, where I live, down to Winchester, where I work. Early was deeply concerned about this, and the map tells the story. If Averell gets to this point, and Early is here, and Horatio Wright is here, Early is stuck in the middle. So he doesn't want to be sandwiched between these two Union forces. So very quickly, on the 19th, he orders his army to withdraw to Winchester and then pull south to Strasburg. Well, once those Confederates have left, Horatio Wright finds out about this the following morning. He ordered his force to cross the river once more, this time all 30,000 of those troops. And as those troops walked over the battlefield where the fighting of July 18th had occurred, the scene was shocking to them. Union soldiers who had been killed in the battle had been hastily buried. And again, this was not something unique in the aftermath of any Civil War battle. And so there were parts of bodies, heads and arms and legs, feet, protruding from the ground. Chaplain Walker of the 18th Connecticut, he wrote, "We found the rebels as usual, had outraged the dead, leaving them but half buried. It was a painful, sickening sight." Some of the Union dead hadn't been buried at all, but their bodies abused and stripped of everything. When Second Lieutenant William Byron Henry of the 116th Ohio walked the battlefield on the afternoon of 20th, he discovered the body of a soldier he loved very, very dearly, almost like a son. And it's the soldier you see there on the screen, Private Samuel Hayes. And when he saw Hayes's body abused, stripped naked, lying in the elements, and I forgot to mention there was a terrible thunderstorm whipping across that part of the valley on the 20th. It enraged him and it made him vengeful. Again, also something that's not unique. 2 weeks after the battle, Lieutenant Henry, he wrote his sister that he was now motivated to retaliate upon the carcasses of live rebels. And this is something you see as I think a common, understandable reaction of soldiers on both sides. They fight, they see a lot of combat, they see a lot of tragedy. But when there's someone who is so close to them, someone they love so dearly, it's now not just in Henry's case about preserving the Union and destroying slavery. Now it is about avenging the treatment of a comrade, a friend, a brother. As Union soldiers scoured the battlefield for survivors, Horatio Wright sent a portion of his army to push westward toward Berryville to see if Early could be found. And so they advanced about 3 or 4 miles further west. They couldn't find any of Early's troops. And Horatio Wright seemed convinced that Early was leaving the valley, going off to join Lee in Petersburg. If that was the case, which in reality it was not, Jubal Early never had any intentions of leaving the valley. But in Wright's mind, this is what he's thinking. And he thought, if Early is leaving the valley, Early no longer poses a threat to invade the North or strike against Washington. So that night, Horatio Wright wrote Grant that he believed the object of the expedition was accomplished. While Horatio Wright was so certain, there were people in his army, there were newspaper correspondents who were embedded with that pursuit force, certainly did not possess that opinion. A correspondent for the New York Herald who was with Wright's force, he wrote, "We must await further news before it is quite possible to say whether we ought not to rejoice over this last invasion." Well, events over the next week and a half, they showed the error of Horatio Wright's judgment about what Early was doing. Early defeated George Crook at the Second Battle of Kernstown on July 24th. And then 6 days later, Confederate cavalry under John McCausland's command, they rode north to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and they burned it. All this proved that Jubal Early had no intention at all of leaving the valley, but rather to remain and continue that campaign of strategic diversion. With Early in the valley, the threat to the capital remained. And because that threat remained, some war planners in Washington declared Wright's pursuit and the Battle of Cool Spring, they declared it a complete and utter failure. Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana, he wrote bluntly that the pursuit and the battle accomplished nothing. Now, while what happened along the banks of the Shenandoah River at Cool Spring might have meant nothing strategically significant, as Early's force remained as much a threat at the end of July as it had a few weeks earlier, the pursuit and the fighting that occurred at Cool Spring, it meant a great deal to Thoburn's veterans. Although Thoburn's men had been tactically defeated, the doggedness, the persistence that they displayed against unfavorable odds became a source of pride for them in the war's aftermath. For the 301 Union soldiers who were wounded in the battle, men such as Colonel James Washburn, who you see on the bottom here of a slide, the commander of the 116th Ohio, who was shot through the left eye, but miraculously survived the wound, a wound that disfigured his face and caused him excruciating, unquantifiable pain until his death in 1898. There was not a day that passed that he did not think about the Battle of Cool Spring. For the families of the 72 Union soldiers who perished at Cool Spring, families such as Ohio's Terry family, wife Marianne Terry and their sons Joseph and Lycurgus, Cool Spring, a battle that many regarded as insignificant, it became the war's most important moment. It was at Cool Spring that Marianne's husband, Joseph and Lycurgus' father, was mortally wounded in the left side of the chest. The Terry family, he was buried on Parker's Island, which is an island situated right smack dab in the middle of the river. And more than likely, his grave is still on that island. The Terry family had no grave to visit. They had no closure. The emotional trauma of receiving that news tormented Marianne Terry for the remaining years of her life. And if she was ever able to put it out of her mind, the receipt of her monthly widow's pension, which initially was $8 a month, it brought that anguish back. To Confederates engaged at Cool Spring, the battle's importance exceeded its status as another Confederate victory in the Valley. For wives transformed into widows, women such as Nancy DeArmond, the wife of the fellow you see here on the screen, Sergeant Aaron Leonidas DeArmond, who fought in the 30th North Carolina, who succumbed to his wounds on August 19th, 1864, when he was actually on his way home, actually died only about 3 miles from his home in Charlotte, North Carolina. The Confederate victory at Cool Spring, it meant nothing to the DeArmond family because that victory cost her and the family everything. For those wounded in the fight, and those such as the 4th North Carolina's John Alexander Stikelether, who you see at the top of the slide, a man who lost 2 very dear friends during the battle, Cool Spring meant a great deal. Stikelether was the color bearer of the 4th North Carolina. He lost in a matter of seconds his 2 best friends, Martin Snow and Sidney Bustle. And he knew what haunted him for the rest of his life, and he lived well into the 1900s, was that his buddies were killed because he was the one carrying the flag. He was the guy that the Union soldiers were targeting. He was the one that their muskets were focused on. But the bullet evaded him and instead took down Snow and Bustle. Their deaths reminded Stikelether that a battle's significance did not draw its importance solely from the numbers of troops engaged, strategic significance, or tactical results. The loss of people he wrote, "I loved like a brother," made the Battle of Cool Spring the war's most significant moment. And I remember reading Stikelether's account and almost being brought to tears by this. Because too often when we study battles, we just look at the map. If I was in charge, I would have done this. And we look at that blue block and that red block. These are people, these are human beings, many of whom are the same age I teach at Shenandoah. People with hopes, lives, and dreams, and in an instant, they're gone. So for those who were engaged at Cool Spring, whether Union or Confederate, the battle's outcome then derived its significance not from any sort of strategic outcome or political outcome. It derived its significance from its multifarious impacts on soldiers and their families. Impacts they carried with them for the rest of their lives, and in some cases were multi-generational. So those consequences, coupled with the battle's intense combat, it branded Cool Spring, at least in the estimation of Stikelether, as a battle that deserved, as he wrote, never to be forgotten. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending and listening this evening. And now we can take some questions.